my screen visible?
Yes.
All right, cool. Okay, so Prime Minister, let's have you.
Sorry, I just want to confirm if I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible, speaker. Before you start your speech, just hold on a minute. Let me confirm my background noise. Okay, so speaker, I think everything is cool with me here. So let's have you, please.
Wait, sorry, can you please repeat that? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I'll be starting my speech in, oh, sorry, I use she, her pronouns, and I'd prefer verbal POIs if that is possible. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. As side proposition, we believe the health, lives, and livelihoods of our citizens have been neglected and abused by the hands of those not qualified or capable of managing it. We stand for the side that acts in the interests of the people and for the healthcare that is not dictated by politics. So we think the central problem that we aim to address in today's debate is that we believe quality healthcare is a monumental right, and that in many developing and underdeveloped nations, we see not only the mismanagement of scarce resources, but also the inability of states to accurately determine the future and current medical needs of its people. Because of the absolute necessity of this right to the quality of life and the responsibility of the state to ensure its accessibility, we believe that it's an obligation of the state that this need be upheld, and we believe our side is best able to achieve this. So what is this debate about, and what is it not about? Well, we think this debate is about which act is best able to cater to the medical needs of its people in a way that would ensure the current and future health of the people. And we do not believe this debate is about the harms or benefits of private versus public healthcare. Why is this? Because our side still maintains public healthcare as we only transfer strategic control of national health departments to a body of experts. And these hospitals would remain publicly funded. They would just not be accountable to Parliament in this regard. So now looking at what our policy looks like, what are the features of it, how do we believe it solves the problem, and how is it different from status quo? Well, we believe by transferring control to a qualified body of experts with experience in the medical field they are managing, we are better able to provide for and predict the needs of the people. As the motion implies, we would transfer complete strategic control of national departments to a body of experts appointed by experienced medical practitioners. This would be doctors, healthcare managers, and anyone else who's experienced in the medical field. Strategic control would include management of the budget, development, skills upliftment, allocation of resources, and various healthcare policies. Additionally, we believe that interference of the state is responsible for the poor quality and inaccessibility of national healthcare in the past, and thus any form of state intervention would be prohibited, including that of Parliament. We think even in countries where the government is not corrupt, we still believe the benefits of this policy make it an amiable policy to implement. If there are any issues with the decisions of the Parliament, decisions of this medical body that have been ill-informed, they can be removed from the body. We believe that there are means of legal approach in the status quo that can be pursued. So why do we think complete control is justified? Well, we think in the status quo, medical advisors do exist to some extent, but they have little to no leverage in these decisions. We aim to change that. I will be discussing the principle, why this principle is justified, why healthcare is better accessible on our side and of better quality, and why we think we are more accountable than the status quo. My second speaker will be diving into an actor's analysis, specifically in regards to why this is better for the people as a whole. So moving on to my first argument, i.e. why is this policy principally justified? Is it within the government mandate to implement this policy? Under this, I'll be showing you that there's a universal need and right for healthcare. And because of the past failures of the government to provide this, this means that the government has a principal obligation to ensure its continued accessibility. I'll frame my analysis under two questions. Why is it more affordable and accessible healthcare so important? Well, we think with COVID and the AIDS pandemic, this has meant that the need for healthcare has only risen over the last decades, but often healthcare is expensive because of the resources needed as well as the scarcity of skills required. And in many countries, the average citizen doesn't have the means to pay for this in proportion to the rising need for medical care. This leaves many individuals not being able to access healthcare because they do not have the income to afford it. The government has tried in the past to provide this through public healthcare, but even so, we have seen a failure to make this not only widely available, but poor decisions leading to poor quality healthcare. And I will later prove to you why the government will always be less capable of providing this kind of healthcare. But secondly, I want to show you under this, why does the government thus have a responsibility to implement this policy in a way that they are best able to provide this? So we think the government works on a basis of utility, not an ideological one, i.e. opposition cannot rebut and say it is the responsibility of government and no one else to make this decision, because governments have a responsibility to implement policies that are the most effective at helping the most people possible. And because many countries have in the past had a failure to provide this, they have an obligation to ensure future success. So under this, I've proven to you why easily accessible healthcare is so important and why the government mandate lies in efficacy rather than just some principle, rather than some ideological obligation. So my second argument has to do with why we ensure better healthcare for individuals on our side. This is extremely important as it shows you why our side is always better in regards to providing better healthcare, and this is essential to proving the efficacy of our policy. So 2 points under this. Firstly, we think that individuals with experience in these fields, which is what our side proposes, and who have studied the nuances of providing healthcare, are naturally in a better position to be making decisions about budgets, about health policy, and the allocation of these resources. And we believe only those who have practiced in the field can truly know the needs and capacity of the medical sector, and the lack of engagement of these individuals in the past in healthcare decisions have led to inaccurate allocation of resources and a misunderstanding of what the field actually needs to be successful for the people. So why don't we think this exists on your side? Because unlike a body elected by parliament that has often no prior experience in the field, and yet is responsible for these decisions, such as like development, skills upliftment, and the allocation of budget and resources, we think that they are often motivated by political incentives that make them unreliable in making decisions that affect the livelihoods of so many people. So we think under this, I've shown you why our side is better at providing healthcare for individuals. Moving on to our last argument about why our policy is more effective at providing healthcare for citizens. But under this, I'm going to show you specifically how the aims of experienced medical practitioners mean they are best able to predict the current and future needs of people. This is different from the previous argument because it specifically defines the incentives of an independently elected body and how that is always more reliable than the incentives of the government. So under this, we think the incentives of experienced medical practitioners ensure accountability because firstly, they are accountable to their field of work, i.e. the oath they made as practitioners and the passion they have as a member of the medical field who has spent their life helping individuals. Thus, the likelihood of them wanting to ensure success of their policies is so much higher. We think also currently the healthcare system, specifically when we look at private healthcare, they are not voted for or voted in for, but they are mainly in many cases able to make good decisions and have and offer healthcare that is accessible to everyone. And also we think they would be accountable to the body of experienced medical practitioners who appoint them. And if they are realized to be ill-advised decisions, they can realize that will cost them the position and therefore are accountable in that manner. Why is this something you cannot achieve on your side? Because the government is held accountable by voters, but this doesn't necessarily mean that their decisions are made in the best interest, because they appeal to a pool of voters that they are most likely to get votes from. This means the exclusion of individuals due to discrimination or even mismanagement of funds. For example, we see Donald Trump allowing for the prohibition of medical healthcare to trans people, or even the Taliban in the 1970s that made healthcare less accessible to women. We think that that this means that there will always be political incentive in these decisions and not the medical needs of the people taken into consideration. And even in cases where there's corruption or the lack of measures to appeal to a higher authority. So we think already we've proven to you they'll be less reliable in providing for the best interest of the people. So we think on our side, we show you why healthcare is more reliable, more accessible, and why we actually provide for the people. We've shown you this, and we think so. That's why I'm so proud to propose. Thank you.
All right, we thank the speaker for that fine speech. Please let's keep the time and then also allow for POI. Teams are advised to ask POI where necessary. Let's welcome leader of opposition to engage.
Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, cool. I'll begin my speech then in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the biggest problem we're going to have with side propositions model is the fact that the people that are holding these medical experts accountable are the very people who appointed them, that is government itself. We think at that point you already give power back to the government, and that's what happens in status quo. We think for all this, in order for them to stand in this debate, they have to accept that there's going to be no accountability for these individuals whatsoever at the point in which you devolve this much power to them and say they are responsible to make their own decisions and act accountably in the first place. A few points of rebuttal then. Firstly, they characterize the main problem being like government corruptions and the fact that they just mismanage funds in general. We think that government overall is still going to be the one allocating resources that exist within the pool of like the country's resources to this body, even if it is separate from them. We think at that point, if there's going to be corruption, it's not something that's mutually exclusive and government can still mismanage those funds. We think that the strategic role that these individuals are actually playing is not one of that much power, but one in which you actually draft the strategy of like how you're actually going to tackle the problem, be it the COVID-19, when we say like we need this many stations in like this specific area where people are going to get tested, or we're going to mandate that this many people need to get vaccinated. Those are the kinds of decisions they're making, right? But secondly, we think in terms of politics, they tell us that like individuals within these spaces are ones who don't make good decisions and aren't like held accountable properly. We think the very backlash that government gets and individuals within government get, just given their like high power in the first place, is something that keeps them in check. But we think that the fact that there's so many different voices in parliament that are able to vote for things and check on strategies and is an accountability mechanism in and of itself, right? But we think that like thirdly, then, in terms of like which side is going to be effective, we don't think it's going to be most effective when you're drafting up strategies that don't include like the other obligation that government has to like other sectors. We think that sectors are interconnected and that government is able to make the best decisions because they are directly involved in all those different sectors. Not that people who are necessarily making these decisions may have studied like genetics or may have studied within the medical field in a specialized realms, but they haven't studied like national budget strategies. They haven't studied politics in and of itself. They don't know how directly different departments are intertwined and how like education helps healthcare and those necessary nuances that we think government has to know and is able to know at the point in which it is a holistic body that sees specifically everything. We think at this point they're able to make the best decisions. What are we talking about within this debate and what is our stance as a whole? We think that our team line for this is going to be that medical bureaucracy seems like the cure, but is in fact the deadliest infection. We think our stance stance is that we prefer status quo, in which we have government have control over the medical sectors. Note two things. Firstly, we can still have government consult with medical professionals at the point in which they don't understand something, and we think they do. We think this looks like the South African government consulting with medical professionals on COVID-19 strategy, but just the Solidarity Fund as a whole. But secondly, we think that like the moment to moment on the ground stuff that happens within a hospital and like the people who run those hospitals and stuff like that aren't necessarily politicians themselves, but the very experts we talk about. We still think they play a major role in status quo, and that is enough. But we think that when it comes to things like strategies about how we're going to like then fund how many vaccines happen, whether we're going to mandate that vaccines happen or not, those are decisions that have to take place with government, because they're able to see everything but have that direct responsibility. But because we're able to hold them accountable much better, we think we can anyways, even at the point in which they have like medical bias, like Trump saying weird things about COVID not existing. We think that the press, the World Health Organizations, and other people in parliaments necessarily solves for that. But we think the problem is not who is in control at the moment, but just resources being finite in general, which means even if we draft up amazing policy from experts, it often means that the resources we have means we have to make trade-offs as governments about what we prioritize and which sectors in society we prioritize. We don't think that this makes it any less important in government's eyes, but things like education are also important. Things like the economy are also important, and those things need to be taken into account. That's how we best protect people as a whole when we look at all their rights and all the ways in which we can improve their lives as government, right? What am I going to be giving you in my speech? I'm going to tell you why specifically government is the most legitimate actor to do this and the only actor we can also hold accountable. But we're going to tell you necessarily that their policy is extremely limited to like corruption in and of itself. And so any benefits they're going to give us have yet to come up, right? What are we talking about then? We think that there are three places in which a government is actually can make decisions for people just based on the amount of power they have. We think firstly that decision needs to be transparent. Secondly, they need to be a legitimate body to do so. And thirdly, we have to be able to hold them accountable. We think that government is able to make decisions for society because we specifically vote them in through an electoral process. And we say then that society transfers responsibility to this direct institution to necessarily make decisions on behalf of them that are in their best interest. We think that an electoral process is imperative to people knowing who that responsibility is actually transferred to, and that being something that is legitimate then because you chose to give up the protection of your rights to the specific person who is going to then take care of that. We think at that point there are arms in which we put in place for government to hold them accountable, such as other bodies of parliament, but the judicial system in and of itself. We think the way we opt out of a bad government or bad healthcare systems or like a government who poorly runs things is firstly these two bodies who can keep them in check, but firstly we can just like vote them out next time, and that's something that's important for an opt-out mechanism for the people that doesn't exist on their side. Secondly, we think government has a specific mandate to protect the people and everyone, right? We think everyone has forfeited this responsibility specifically to government, even medical experts themselves, right? Why is this true? Because government can see the bigger picture and see all the interests that we need to take care of in order to take care of your fundamental rights. I already brought up education, but just like issues such as poverty and how that might harm people is something that needs to be seen. We think we then centralize the power to be able to recognize all these intersections and make decisions accordingly based on what they see, right? Which means if we can't fund something within medicine that would be effective but can't necessarily happen because we need to prioritize like subsidizing housing, that's something that should be able to happen, and we think that government is valid in making those decisions, and that's likely the trade-offs that are what that leads to the harms they're talking about in status quo, but we think those are things that are justified given the equal obligation to all of your rights, right? We think then it's not about actually understanding the medical issue itself, because then we think then in those cases government does consult, and we have organizations that are global, such as the World Health Organization, to talk about strategy and field reports and give things that capacitate government to make good decisions. We think at that point government is already making the best decisions but secondly, that we hold them the best accountable at the point in which we can actually hold them out, right? Vote them out. In terms of efficacy then we think that because government has all this power and we capacitated to do these things, we think it actually has the lobbying power to get things done. We think this looks like Rwanda necessarily going into the economic industry and shutting down hotels to make these like isolation states. We don't think a group of random people have the specific lobbying power to go infringe on the economic industry and do this. We think at that point you get the best outcomes on our side.
All right, we thank the speaker for that fine speech. We recognize the Deputy Prime Minister to respond.
Hi, just checking that I am audible.
Yes, you're audible, speaker. Let's have it.
Okay, awesome. In that case, I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Health and safety aren't political. They are basic rights and they should be separate from the governments and in the hands of professionals. My case split for today's speech is firstly doing some analysis on what is best for citizens and what is best for health workers, under the core question of which form of health department is best for the people. However, before I get into this, I'm going to do some rebuttal of their side opposition first speaker. So first piece of rebuttal here is under accountability. So firstly, I just want to clarify the government isn't appointing these people, other health experts are appointing them, and it is in fact a body of experts. Let's look then at they give us this idea of how they have much better accountability. However, this isn't exactly true because government policies are incredibly hard to undo. Let's take as an example the vicious cycle of in the United States of Republicans putting in a bunch of hugely conservative policies and then Democrats being unable to do anything in their terms because they're just trying to undo all of that mess. So as much as it's good for you to say that, yes, we can vote these people out, you only get rid of them after they've already harmed people. As much as the government has a mandate to protect the citizens, it doesn't mean that they actually do so. And your side has relied far too much on the government being an apparently good actor. Second piece of rebuttal then about efficiency in terms of the interconnectedness of all things and a holistic view of the country, we think, well, that's not impossible for these people to do because while, yes, there are going to be medical experts on the panel, we think that they're not just going to appoint medical experts. They're going to appoint people who have studied politics, who can best come up with policy. They're going to appoint finance experts who understand how they can actually make this policy work monetarily. And so we think that that point also falls a bit flat. I'll flag you on the points about the electoral process of voting as it goes very nicely into my positive matter. Fourth point of rebuttal then about the funding. I think that, yes, while the government does assign funds, our problem isn't the fact that so many funds get assigned to housing or so many funds get assigned to the medical industry. Our problem exists regardless of corruption, and how we fix this is using the funds we have, allocating them properly to which sectors of the medical sector need them most. And so we think that our point there, it still stands in terms of funding. Something I'd like to note concluding my rebuttal is that our worst case that side opposition has framed, where people are paid off, where it's biased, where the policy isn't effective and there isn't really as much of an understanding of how healthcare works, is literally their status quo with the government making policy. So already they're not looking too good in this debate. However, let me get into my positive matter of how our side is better for both citizens and healthcare professionals. And I'll be doing this on 3 levels. Firstly, let's look at the qualification of people making decisions. It's here that I flag you on your electoral process of voting analysis. So let's use an analogy here that when you're wounded, do you stitch yourself up and hope you don't get infected? No, you go to a doctor. The reason you do this is because medicine is very complicated, and your average citizen or even government official only has a surface level, very poor understanding of how it actually works. So we think that if you'd rather have a qualified doctor than the average person with, say, an opinion operating on you when you need surgery, then you probably agree that it is a good idea to have that same qualified doctor rather than the average person making decisions that affect that surgery. We therefore think that while obviously you can vote your government in for social policy, things that the average citizen understands, we would much rather medical professionals make medical policy decisions. Conclusively then, we think that it is better for citizens as better medical professionals make better decisions and than the voted in governments, and so they get better medical health care, which overall is going to benefit them. My second layer of this point is the consistency of healthcare. What we see in the status quo is that the healthcare system changes with governments, it changes with policy, it changes with politics. What is better on our side is that we see a much steadier system, especially for, say, people with long-term conditions who need consistency in their healthcare. What we also fix is the status quo problem of government being unlikely to input long-term policies because someone else, possibly a rival party, is going to get credit for them. Therefore, we think that a more constant board of people who aren't constantly under election fear and voter pressure are more likely to put in long-term better policies because they aren't as afraid that their rival party is going to get credit for them. Therefore, under the second level, it's also better for citizens in terms of getting consistent policy. Third level then, on what the decision making is based upon, we think this is very important because government makes their policies based on what is acceptable. This is a piece of analysis called the Overton window, where government can or cannot make policy based on whether their voters are going to be okay with it. An example of this is Trump endorsing plenty of COVID-19 very unsafe practices and fake news and appointing experts who would agree with him whether or not it was actually true, because that was what his voters wanted. A further example, which is happening in China right now, in order to seem different from the States, they've manipulated COVID-19, and Shanghai is currently in lockdown, where people have been locked in and are starving. Diabetics are dying because they can't get insulin, and pets are being killed under the pretext of this being a good medical decision and them only treating COVID-19 and trying to stop the spread of it. People's health has gotten political and people are dying. What's more likely for you to see on side proposition with our policy is this health board actually doing what is best for health in terms of making medically sound policies not taken. And while we concede that there's always going to be a bias, we think that it's less likely you're going to see a political one coming through. And doctors are trained not to be biased anyways. So as much as bias exists on both sides, we think that on our side, it is going to be less. And so our decisions are made on a better basis. This is the third level. We are overall much better for citizens. Looking then at why we're also better for medical health professionals, well, in the status quo, most policy only looks at citizens. An example of this is the mistreatment of these same health professionals during the COVID-19 pandemic. How we fix this is because when medical professionals are elected, these are people who understand what healthcare providers go through. So we'll get policies more specific and helpful for these people because they know the issues faced in a way government doesn't. So conclusively then, my speech has shown you not only why it's better for citizens on the three levels of qualification, consistency, and decision making, also why it's better for medical professionals in actually getting policy that's good for them. But I've also unpacked why side opposition is completely invalid. So I must beg you today to stand with side proposition in the debates, as after all, we are the only valid side that is good for both citizens and healthcare providers.
All right, we thank the speaker for that fine speech. We recognize the leader of opposition to engage.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, please, you're audible.
Okay, I prefer my POIs verbally. My pronouns are she, her, but I just prefer if you address me as speaker. I'll be beginning in a moment. Just let me set up my personal timer. Okay. All right. I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, panel, a couple of things that you can expect to hear from my speech is how trust is very important when we're talking about this context of the debate and why it is worsened on side proposition side of the House, but also how within whatever they're perpetuating on their side, taking them at their best case scenario, they're most likely to make a couple of trade-offs that we think will have detrimental effects within themselves. But before that, a couple of corrections from side proposition second speaker. We find it unfair to claim that doctors are trained in not being biased and so on and so forth, and most likely they're just being trained within being medical practitioners. So we think that is a claim that is an absolute fallacy and shouldn't be something that the adjudicators should use as an actual rebuttal to this debate. Secondly, we think at a point in time where they say that we'll just appoint political experts, so on and so forth, is one contradictory to the first speaker who was very vivid in the experts that they're wanting to appoint are doctors themselves. But secondly, we think it is not in the spirit of the motion or the debate, where we think they ultimately then squirrel the motion at a point in time where you're going to be appointing economists, political experts, and so on and so forth, means there's virtually almost nothing on our side of the House to defend. So it is not in the spirit of the motion for them to perpetuate that on their side of the House. Secondly, I'll then have incorporated rebuttal within my positive matter. So how exactly do we think certain things that they're willing to them attaining effective healthcare will lead to certain trade-offs that we're not willing to make? So at a point in time where we think these doctors aren't trained within the intersectionality of things to do with economics and so on and so forth, and then them taking
POI?
the position in terms of making policies and so on and so forth, we think that they're most likely to make decisions that then aren't in consideration of the other sections within government. Often at times, the medical policy may not be seen as truly efficient or exercising the most efficacy it can be, because there are other government obligations to do within the budget that may mean the healthcare sector doesn't receive as said much allocation of resources and funds, because government is obligated to answer calls to other sectors of society. And we think within the point in fact that even on prop side of the House, where government is still going to be the ones providing said resources, this is something that side proposition can't neglect at the end of the day, when we tell you at a point where government is obligated to more than just the health sector, and then these said policies that the health sector then comes up with are still going to be needed to be come up with a final review to do with the national budget and so on and so forth. Side proposition must engage us on how then they're going to achieve these policies that we definitely think will not be in consideration of other things that are happening in status quo. Secondly, we think at a point in time where we've told you that what we're directly against is these people attaining control over policy making and so on and so forth, but government is still allowed to have these doctors and experts as an advisory board to advise them on medical policy. We fail to see then how they best uphold, in conjunction with this whole issue of intersectionality, how they best achieve a situation that's better for everyone. So this is going to go into my point of how certain things government knows about people. So where they might wish to vaccinate every baby, or they might want to control COVID at the best of their abilities, they fail to account for things that people might think might be infringed on with the implementation of policies, like acquiring buy-in, cultural beliefs, and rights will actually then cause more of an outcry than the policies that we think government has implemented in an attempt to make sure that multitudes of groups of people are actually pleased. Secondly, we think trust is worsened on their side. So we think things with COVID-19 has desensitized the trust between people and the healthcare system. We think that system, and that is something we're acknowledged of, but we think it opted in a government that they voted for, and we think it is unfair for them to just wave it away, that there isn't a valid accountability that comes within being voted for. In an event where those in charge are not elected by the people, this draws lines for a lot of confusion. People who haven't been elected, having control devolved to them, is something we disagree with, when in most countries we see this trust imparted when someone actually is voted into government. There's a level of accountability involved at a moment where someone has availed themselves to be appointed into parliament, and nationally someone has been appointed, where we find systems that involve mass control, and that individual wasn't appointed by the masses, equates directly to issues coming up when something goes wrong or someone doesn't live up to the standard. We think at a point in time where they tell us then corruption and so on and so forth is mitigated on their side of the house is something that we do not agree with at all. Where medical practitioners and fraud is something very apparent, and a point of cases of overcharging, undercharging, misdiagnosis for more money, and so on and so forth, and corruption is prevalent on both sides of the house. Now, at a point where we say that parliament and government bodies can be openly critiqued for the corruption that happens on their part, considering parliament won't have a say in whatever happens within this medical body, as this body isn't accountable to them, which means they don't report back to them, means corruption can occur just as easy at a point where these medical practitioners answer to no one besides the medical practitioners. So this is where the key clarification of the debate is, where we won't accept them saying these medical practitioners will then be appointing political experts, because we think it is intuitive that a medical practitioner is best to appoint someone who's best in the medical field. So we think what's actually happening in status quo is doctors or people within the medical field then being appointed to these bodies. So we think that they have no fiat whatsoever then in terms of political, economic policy making, and their policies will most likely be medical driven. But where we have shown you in the issue of intersectionality, this can lead to a lot more problems than actually solve them. I'll take your PI.
Because we've already told you that the set budget will still be allocated by the government, but doctors and healthcare managers, as we told you in the beginning of this debate, are individuals who have managed medical departments and run hospitals or group of hospitals for years. They don't need to be versed in social policies to understand the intersectionality of medical departments. Please engage with this.
I still think they do need to be versed in the issue of social issues and so on and so forth, where we tell you that the issues of rights to choice, cultural beliefs, and so on and so forth will actually affect at a point at which how you're allocating this budget. We find that when we see that medical practitioners, and there's a little level of medical bureaucracy that occurs in the state, we think that drawing the example of Fauci in the CDC, and we think during the time of Donald Trump, where he was actually devolved a level of medical bureaucracy, led to a lot of chaos, because some of their policies won't actually be centered towards best allocating what is medicinally best and what is proportionally best considering whatever resources they have, but they fail where we think the medical system in itself is also lacking within studies that differentiate what different types of people and so on and so forth need, is what is government brings to the equation at a point in time that we think they bring that strategic importance. So to then say that they don't need the social skills, they don't need the economic skills, and they don't need the political skills to then allocate resources towards certain centers, but just the medicinal or medical knowledge for them to then make adequate policy, is something that we won't accept on our side of the house, especially when we think of like devolving which areas need more resource allocation, etc., so on and so forth, is something that is directly involved within government research, government policy making, and so on and so forth, is a response that we're not willing to accept on your side of the house. So panel, at the end of the day, what do both sides brought to you? So we think side proposition has been running away from the motion. At a point in time, we actually see some strategic flaws happening on their side of the house, where first speaker talks about medical experts appointing doctors into these health boards, and then second speaker talks about appointing political, economic, and so on and so forth experts, where we show you that is not fair in the squaring of the debate and is not in the spirit of the motion that they should be arguing. They also talk to you about how policies will be better evident, and that corruption, something that will be removed, and how they create a better accessibility and so on and so forth. But when we tell you at a point in time that better accessibility and better healthcare is best attained at a point in time where someone is not just making decisions based off of their medical knowledge, but also the political knowledge, the economical knowledge, and the sociological knowledge, which is something that we see that is currently happening in status quo, is why side opposition deserves to win this debate.
All right, we thank the speaker for that speech. Please, let's keep to time. Let's keep to time, so we have to run this quickly. Having said that, let's welcome the government whip to respond.
Hi everyone, my name is Zara and my pronouns are she, her. I prefer verbal POIs and I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The nature of the medical field in and of itself already deals with intersectionality. A medical director who's faced both poor and rich patients, who faced women, who's faced people of color, does understand the different social nuances and the different cultural nuances of practicing medicine. Even better than that, they understand the importance of the economic and social nuances within the context of practicing medicine, within the context of their medical field. If anything, they're a better actor in looking at this. We think that the main core questions that we need to weigh this debate upon is firstly the idea of what form of management is better for the people, and secondly the idea of what form of management is more legitimate. We think the most important clash here, because we're looking at something as vital and something as life-changing and as medicine, is the clash of efficiency or what form of management is better for the people. Under this, we've gotten 3 main lines of argumentation from them. The idea of what, like the nature of strategic control, who are we electing, and the incentives of different bodies. In terms of the nature of strategic control, there's some things that we need to note within this case. We think that what they give us is a very narrowed understanding. They tell us that it's just generally about things like drafting strategies about like vaccinations and all of that. But we think the nature of strategic control is something that is a long-term goal. We think it's dependent on the progress of national health, but further than just drafting up the policy, we think that the individuals engaging with strategic control are also managing the implementation of that. Why is that something that is then very important in our case? We think our second speaker gave you matter about the importance of long-term policies when looking at healthcare and when looking at health management. We say if we look at the example of the US in the transition from Obama to Trump, the idea of the Affordable Care Act was discontinued by the Trump administration, harming the possible benefits that could progress within that medical sphere. We think that when we value something as progress in their medical sphere, we think that that strategic control is something that needs to be longer term than simply switching political parties. Further than that, their argumentation about budgeting and the decisions are not in tune with other obligations of government. What we need to understand within this debate is firstly, what is symmetrical? We think that's the budgets. We think that the government is still going to be allocating the national budget. We think the government is still going to be saying that this portion is going to be spent on national healthcare. This portion is going to be spent on education. We think that this is how it works in the status quo. So both sides of this debate have the same amount of money allocated towards the medical sector. The thing that we're supposed to be debating is how that money is used. We told you that in status quo, when you don't necessarily have these government officials knowing what's best for that medical sector, when you're allocating these resources, you might have mismanagement of this, whereas with a developed body of experts, we don't necessarily think that this is going to happen. We think that further than that, they do acknowledge the need of medical experts in consultation. They said that the government can still consult professionals, but they're against them making policy. We think that this then brings into question how much power they think that these professionals can have. If they think that they're qualified enough to be consulted, we think that they're even more qualified than the government to be making these policies. We think that under their side, these medical professionals don't necessarily have a say because they don't have access to policy making strategies. The government can simply shut down their opinion in favor of what that governmental body needs. We think that further than that, the next important argumentation under this clash is who are we electing? We think that we've made it clear, and the motion says a body of experts. It doesn't necessarily say a body of medical experts, simply that they're appointed by medical practitioners. We think that under this, it can be inclusive of things of people who are versed in economics, of people who are versed in politics. But even if we go with the understanding that that's spoiling the debate, my introduction proves that these individuals who have experience in medical administration do already take into account different aspects of intersectionality, like the economics and the social factors of the patient that they're treating. So we do think that they're well versed in that. But even if in our absolute worst case scenario, where all these experts know is medical, we don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to have a focus on medicine. We think an economic sector can have a focus on economics, an education sector can focus its budget on education. So we think that the prioritization of medicine in the medical sector is something that is then still legitimate, something that is still then effective. The next to look at here is the idea of the incentives of different groups. We think that we don't necessarily get like any rebuttal. The only rebuttal we get against our arguments here is the idea that doctors might still have a bias. We say that we think doctors do go through training to go against that bias, but even if they do have that, we think it's comparatively less harmful than an institutional bias of a governmental body. What's important to understand here is that the government that is representing the people has different alliances to different groups of people and is also trying to appease voters that would generally vote for them. We think that are always going to appeal for that voter base. We think that that leaves other people behind. We think that that still disenfranchises the minority within this. We think that relationships, especially in capitalist democracies, between governments and parties and different corporations like America, like the opioid sector, is something that infringes on healthcare. Even if that government is not corrupt, the relationship that it has centers politics instead of healthcare. We don't ever think that is something that can be efficient for a healthcare sector. The importance of this clash here is to show you that both sides have highlighted the importance of good strategic policies in terms of healthcare. We think that then the side that wins this debate is the one who's able to prove what form of management is hence more effective. We told you in terms of the nature of strategic control, who we are electing and the incentives of different bodies, why we are then better. The next clash that we need to talk about here is what form of management is more legitimate. Under this, the main two arguments they gave us was like the electoral and accountability. Under the electoral, they say that you choose to give up the protection of you choose to give up certain rights for the protection of government. And then they told us in their second speech, they don't trust people who haven't been elected or wasn't appointed by the masses. It's important to then look at the national health departments in countries. We don't think that these individuals are directly appointed by citizens. We think that the election of ministers of different departments is done by the party that is voted in power. So whilst you may vote that party in power, you still you're not necessarily voting for the National Health Department. So by your understanding in and of itself, because you're not choosing to vote for that thing, it wasn't appointed necessarily by the masses, it's something that you then view as illegitimate. We think that when we're looking at this, then we think that if you can agree with the main concepts of one party, but still disagree with the National Health Department, we think that then challenges the legitimacy argument that they bring to us. The next argument under legitimacy, they say that in order for a body to be legitimate, the people must be able to hold them accountable. We think that the idea of voting out parties doesn't necessarily happen in countries that are very attached to certain parties, but also we still have mechanisms of holding our group of people accountable. These medical doctors, we still think that they're bound by the oaths of the profession, but further than that, they're also bound by the Constitution and the judiciary. We think that a judiciary is more likely to be able to hold these body of experts accountable than hold an entire governmental organization accountable. We think that on that part, we still get better accountability on our side. What's important to note here is that under this clash, we've proven that that their side of the house doesn't necessarily prove the legitimacy of government as a body. We've shown you that these experts are less likely to be biased and less likely to fall into political whims as governmental parties. We've shown you why they're more accountable. The importance and strategic importance of my speech here is then to say we've proven to you why our form of management is better for the people, engaging in a range of different people as experts. We've shown you why we're the most legitimate body. The side that prioritizes furthering healthcare for individuals and medicine is the side that wins this debate. Side opposition wins. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for that fine speech. We recognize opposition with.
Okay, cool. Give me a second to set up my timer. I'll be taking POIs in the text space, this one. And also preferred pronouns, he, him, please, but preferably don't address me personally. Cool. That said, my timer is ready. Assuming I'm audible, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Speaker, when systems exist within specific nations, that is to say, even at a point at which those systems are not accountable to government, they do not necessarily gain complete autonomy to a system whereby they can bypass laws that directly contradict laws that have been passed by governments, especially when they're medical institutions that merely seek to make the health system better. What this means is in a country where particularly things such as being transgender are illegal, a things such as being transgender are illegal, or generally the LGBTQI are not accepted in said country. Even this specific body cannot necessarily allow you to transition because they still exist underneath that specific government, even though government won't look into their accountability mechanisms. The reason why this piece of context is very important is because it takes out all the arguments that proposition wants to give you on how governments all of a sudden pass said laws that are so bad for people, on how like governments favor specifically one party or one specific type of people, and this is going to be extremely bad. We want you to notice they fear that these individuals will generally just look at how this general like money and everything is distributed within the societies. They're not necessarily that involved in policymaking and other things. What this directly means is they just can't argue that government is extremely discriminatory and things of that sort. I said pure eyes in the chat. The second thing that's very important to understand within this debate, right, is what exactly do doctors look like and what do medical experts do within status quo that capacitates them to do specific things. Because I'm going to call government on their bluff, because government tells you a few things. They tell you that medical practitioners are individuals who know the ins and outs of medicine, and all this is particularly important. Let's run a concession here for a second. We concede that all of this is important, but there is one logical link that government doesn't tell you within the specific debate. They don't show you why being a medical practitioner makes you an individual who is capacitated and who is generally able to actually pick or elect individuals who will then become part of a body that actually then like decides on how to set up specific policies that have to do within the health sector within itself. Why is this very important? Because when they want to tell you in third speech that their stance is to say that these medical practitioners will merely just sit down and then pick specific individuals or experts and then say this person is an expert in economics, we think they should take part as we make certain decisions, etc., etc. They don't establish the necessary link of how someone who is cooped up in an office and merely just practicing surgery on other individuals now all of a sudden has the capacity to go out and pick the best person who is suited to be an economist and look particularly into economics that relate to the medical field and how that works better. The reason why this logical link was important is because the rest and like all of their other pragmatic benefits that they want to tell you about within this debate are contingent on these people picking the best individuals capable of doing that specific job, which is a link that they do not establish in the first place and is something that cannot fly for them on their side of the debate. The second thing that we think is very important is the principle within this debate, because proposition completely ignores the principle. They want to tell you that healthcare is so important that as long as we get good healthcare, we don't really care about the principle. I'm going to call their bluff on why primarily it is very important that rights are given by the individuals who are supposed to give them. We say, notice that the history of most dictatorships within status quo have been dictatorships that were particularly good on certain levels. That is to say, they were probably very capacitated in giving people the right amounts of food and having access to education and so many other things. They were very good in policy making and making things that were particularly good for citizens. That did not in any way justify their existence of them seizing power and having control over specific things. We say the only world in which we think things are justified is when they are done by the very same individuals that people put into power. Why do we think that this is particularly important? We think one, in first speech proposition, they tell you that this is still publicly funded healthcare. Why is this important? We think anytime it is publicly funded anything, it should be under state control. Why is this important? We think for a few reasons. Number one, when people vote politicians into power, but more importantly, when people pay taxes and so many other things, they take these things to the very same body that they have put into power and that they've entrusted with making decisions that are best fitted for them. But the most important thing about this principled argument is who holds these very same individuals accountable, right? Why is this very important? This healthcare is supposed to benefit citizens. Why do we think then it is most important that citizens hold whichever body does this thing accountable? Notice, when government makes say policies, it means that whatever that is held accountable by the citizens themselves. This is important because we think they're the direct beneficiaries of these very same systems, right? And we think them holding these particular individuals accountable makes it something that is that makes it a system that works better. When they tell you that medical practitioners, then those are the ones that elected these people, hold them accountable. They still let the very mere strategic analysis of why medical practitioners are capacitated to do this, but also are best fitted to do this, besides merely saying they know medicine. We don't think there was enough mechanization. I'm going to go on to show you why particularly we even get better policy change on our side of the house. But before that, I'll take a POI. Okay,
are
cool.
plenty of
Nothing.
no. Oh, sorry. Do you still want to take the POI?
Yeah, sure, go.
Okay. There are plenty of state-funded organizations, such as those like Eskom that provide electricity, or those like SABC in South Africa that offer national television. We think these are privately run, but they are state-funded. Do you doubt the legitimacy of those corporations as well?
We're very happy to debate how much Eskom has been failing to provide electricity within South Africa, or how SABC is so incompetent when it comes to their broadcasting on any other day. If anything, that just shows you how whenever states merely take out their money to certain entities that are separate from them, and when they don't hold them accountable, they just become worse, vis-a-vis Eskom, which constantly has shutdowns on electricity in South Africa every single day. Come on. But the next thing that we think is primarily important to understand within this debate is exactly we need people to understand that at the point at which you pass policies that affect health. We think this was the most important chat to understand within this debate, because we don't necessarily think that healthcare merely starts at a point at which individuals are sick and at a point at which individuals need to be taken care of. We say healthcare starts at the basic grassroots of things. That is to say, the lack of access to things that are sanitary, the lack of access to basic things that create the social fabric, food, etc., which are all things that are still government run on their side of the house. What this means is the healthcare body that they have now created merely still just has to deal with extra burdens. Why do we think that this is better off on our side of the house? We think because state has control of all these entities. That is to say, to make sure that people have access to sanitation, which if they don't have, they'll end up sick and needing healthcare. Also to make sure that state has access to things, such as basic economic and finances. We say this intersectionality allows them to make policies that are good on all grounds, that also don't negatively affect the healthcare sector. But at the point at which states no longer have the capacity to control healthcare sector, we do think that they're going to make policies in other sectors that don't affect healthcare in a bright light, or healthcare might make policies that don't affect these other sectors in a bright light. We say when you look at COVID-19, right, within this specific period, in as much as we needed to shut down the work within specific areas in order to make sure that we took care of our healthcare sector, we still needed to keep a certain aspect of our economic side still open, so that we had a balance between all of these things. We think that the only sector that can truly balance out how everything works out is state within itself, and we think that that is very important. There's a few things that we've told you within this debate. We told you, if they put medical practitioners within these very spaces, they are not capacitated to do anything because they don't understand the full dynamics. But even if they elect certain people, they don't show you why medical practitioners are capacitated to elect any of those people. But more importantly, they don't show you principled justification for that to happen. On opposition, we show you all these things, and we show you a better offer for individuals. We are proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the speaker for that fine speech. We now recognize opposition reply speaker.
Okay, I'll begin my speech then in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I told you from my speech that these governments have finite resources, and the only reason we don't have the most efficient medical strategies we could is because necessary trade-offs are being made when drafting up those particular strategies, trade-offs that recognize other fundamental rights. What did they not understand from my very speech and from this debate as a whole? It was that when their body of experts that wasn't voted in and cannot be held accountable by anyone in any substantial format, we think that when they specifically said that you need to vaccinate every single child who goes to school, and you're going to mandate that as a policy for that child to get an education, we think that was an effective policy. However, is it economically feasible? And secondly, do you have a population that is educated enough to actually value that particular policy in the first place? Thirdly, is it constitutionally valid given people's right to choice? And can you then, as this illegitimate body, decide when you restrict that, a privilege that only government has? And will that even be perceived as a good in society? Are you going to have backlash? These were questions that were posed from first to third speech across the bench, and none of them they have actually sufficiently answered. We think the first reason is because they have a specifically important case shift within this debate. Firstly, they tell us that medical practitioners know things, hence they're going to be making these policies. We don't think that was true at the point in which they were the ones appointing, but we said at the point in which they are making the policies, you don't have accountability because you're just just holding yourself accountable. Then they told us, no, don't worry. It's economists who are making these decisions and people who are well versed in politics, things that they couldn't even tell us. But secondly, we thought that these individuals themselves already existed within parliaments, given the range of departments that exists there. Why is this an exclusive benefit they get? They couldn't tell us anyways. We told you that the very fact that that second leg exists, but secondly, that you're likely consulting medical practitioners in the first place means that these people are already involved in the process in a way in which society values. Why? Because government was the most legitimate. I gave you a principal analysis to say that you as an individual forfeited responsibility to someone you voted in, to someone you trusted to protect your rights, and that particular person has a special mandate to do so, and when they don't, you vote them out. No, they didn't even tell us what accountability looks like on their side. That medical board of practitioners could just say, don't do it again. And we, at that point, that wasn't a valid form of accountability, given the stakes of the rights that are healthcare in the first place. We didn't accept it, but we didn't think society would accept such an illegitimate body making decisions on behalf of them when they don't directly know these individuals or trust them. We thought we were going to get massive backlash, something that came out in second. But why did we tell you that efficiency is something that they can't even get on their side better than us? We told you that government has a lot of lobbying power to make things happen and to get other departments to comply. That's to say, if this specific government even wanted to like mandate something or make it happen, they would now need to convince all these different people to necessarily do that thing without having the leverage of being voted in, without having a societally accepted amount of power. This was something that came out at first at the end of my speech, something that they never told us was something that they deal with. We think efficiency is likely to be better. But at the point in which we said government can still understand the issue by consulting, we didn't understand why then just having these people make policies which they aren't legitimate enough to do was something that was even beneficial. Not they give us weird examples within this debate and say that like Obama wanted to do this, but Trump's administration wanted to do this. We think the trade-offs we said were already stuff that was principally legitimate, given the fact that people necessarily traded off that protection in the first place to Trump's administration. We think the trade-offs he made was an economic one. And if he thought that best fulfilled people's rights, that was something that was okay. So proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the speaker for that fine speech. We recognize affirmative reply speaker to end the debate.
I'm sorry, I'm just getting my time out. Okay, I'll be starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1. 3 questions in today's debate. Firstly, which side is most effective and best for the actors that have been identified in today's debate? Secondly, which side is most accountable? And thirdly, which side is principally justified? We feel the side that was best able to answer these questions was able to win this debate. So under the first question, i.e., which side is most principally justified, I gave you 3 reasons in the beginning of this debate as to why our side is principally justified to implement this policy. I told you that the government works on the basis of utility, not an ideological one. Therefore, when opposition told us that it is the responsibility of the government and no one else to make these decisions, we told you that the government's responsibility rather lies with implementing policies that are effective in helping the people in the best capacity. And we told you specifically, because of the past failure of the government to provide this, if we could have proved that our side is more effective in doing this, that obligation to ensure future success is still something they need to contend with. Opposition supported this when they admitted the value of efficacy, when they, in response to my POI in the third speaker, said that they don't value privately run but publicly funded or corporations when they are not run well. We think on this very concession, we'd already won that clash under the principal justification. So under the second clash, we get this idea of which side, is most effective and best for actors. We get the following arguments from opposition. Firstly, that medical experts do not have the managerial skills in terms of how departments interact. And to this, we told you from the beginning that doctors and healthcare managers would be part of these body of medical experts. These are individuals who have managed the medical departments, who have run hospitals and groups of hospitals for years. You don't need to be versed in social policy like opposition insisted. And we told you they often can understand economics within that field because it actually affects them. Secondly, we told you that the set budget would still be allocated by the government, so it wouldn't interfere with other departments. And we lastly told you in our third speaker speech that you acknowledge the value of this medical consultation when you say that it still exists under your side. We, however, told you that currently it is not effective because they are not involved with the actual leverage of decision making. And when we give you those responses, the only responses we got beyond the assertion that healthcare managers are not capable of understanding the intersectionality, we feel like we dealt with those responses, and just the assertion, continued assertion of that doesn't actually deal with it, and thus we won that clash. But secondly, when we told you how this is best for actors, we told you it's best for the healthcare decisions of citizens because it's made by people who understand, and therefore people are likely to get better allocation and better healthcare policies in a way that is best for their health by people who actually understand that. We also told you in our second speaker's speech how there's a greater awareness of issues dealt by medical professionals. Therefore, we're likely to get policies that are directed to the well-being of medical professionals. So we think under this clash, we tell you that we are able to engage with what they have said, and we gave you benefits beyond those that have already been said, benefits that we don't get on side opposition side. So we think then under the last clash, which side is most accountable, comes to the last clash of who wins this debate. We got the following from opposition. Firstly, medical experts lack accountability because they're not accountable to voters. And secondly, the problem with discrimination or exclusion of individuals would still exist because they are they're still accountable to the government. But the issue with this response is that it fails to engage with the matter we gave you from first, i.e. that medical professionals are accountable to the field of work, the oath they made, and a passion as a member of the medical field who has spent their life contributing to this field. We also told you they're accountable to the body of experienced medical practitioners who appoint them, not the government. So that idea of discrimination that you bring up doesn't stand after that, because the whole reason we offer accountability to medical practitioners is because they're able to make decisions that are unbiased and unswayed by political opinion. And we think from this, what we've given you, we were able to deal with what has been said, and that is why we won today's debate. Thank you.
All right, we thank the speaker for that fine speech and thank everyone for bringing the debate to exhaustion.